In 1778, a Jewish immigrant was being held prisoner by the British in occupied New York. According to later accounts, he'd been caught helping the American revolutionaries, was facing execution, but somehow escaped. Within a few years, the future president James Madison was relying on him for money. This is History Makers, a series where I introduce you to the people who shaped and reshaped Jewish history. Our next history maker is Haym Salomon, a Polish-born Jewish immigrant, merchant, financier, and revolutionary who became one of the most fascinating figures in the creation of the United States. Salomon was born around 1740 in Leszno, then part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, into a Jewish community with extensive commercial connections across Europe. Much of his early life remains obscure, but he appears to have travelled across Europe, acquired considerable knowledge of languages and finance, and eventually crossed the Atlantic. By 1775, he was living in New York City. His timing could hardly have been more dramatic. That same year, fighting at Lexington and Concord began the American Revolutionary War, and Salomon chose the revolution. He became associated with the Sons of Liberty, the network of activists resisting British rule. Then, in 1776, things changed. The British captured New York. Salomon was arrested, but he had a very useful skill. He spoke several European languages. The British employed him as an interpreter for their Hessian auxiliaries, German troops hired to fight alongside the British, and Salomon appears to have used his position against them. Later accounts claimed that he encouraged Hessian soldiers to desert and helped American prisoners escape. Eventually, the British discovered what he was doing, and in 1778 he was arrested again. His son would later claim that Salomon had been sentenced to death and escaped only after sacrificing a substantial quantity of gold. We can't independently verify all the details of that story. What we do know is that Salomon definitely escaped British-controlled New York and resurfaced in Philadelphia. There his story evolved further because the American Revolution had a serious problem. It was running out of money. Armies needed food, soldiers needed wages, weapons had to be purchased, and the currency issued by the Continental Congress was collapsing in value. The expression "not worth a continental" eventually entered the American vocabulary for that very reason. The revolution increasingly depended upon loans and financial assistance from European powers, especially France. But a French bill of exchange sitting on someone's desk wasn't the same thing as cash an American army could actually spend. Someone had to sell it, convert it, find buyers, move the money through an 18th century financial system spanning the Atlantic. And this was exactly the world that Haym Salomon understood. In Philadelphia, he established himself as a broker and merchant, dealing in the bills of exchange and government securities. Eventually, he began working closely with Robert Morris, the Superintendent of Finance of the United States, the man tasked with somehow keeping the revolutionary government solvent. Morris needed brokers capable of turning foreign credit into usable money. Salomon became one of them. Robert Morris's financial records repeatedly document transactions involving Haym Salomon, but perhaps the best glimpse we have of Salomon comes from another revolutionary figure, James Madison. Yes, the future fourth president of the United States. In 1782, Madison was serving in the Continental Congress, and he was basically broke. Virginia wasn't providing its congressional delegates with enough money to cover their expenses in Philadelphia, so Madison borrowed from Haym Salomon. Again and again, at one point Madison wrote that he had become a pensioner on the favor of Haym Salomon. In another letter, he referred affectionately to Salomon as his little friend in Front Street. And there was another detail. Madison explained that Salomon normally made money by charging people for arranging loans. But when struggling members of Congress came to him, he apparently refused to profit from their predicament. Instead, Madison said Salomon supplied money from his own funds. Think about that. One of the principal authors of the future United States Constitution was being financially kept afloat by a Jewish immigrant from Poland. And Salomon wasn't only helping Madison, he brokered substantial financial transactions for the revolutionary government and lent money to other members of Congress. And while he was helping finance the revolution, he was becoming increasingly involved in another struggle. This one was explicitly Jewish. Philadelphia was home to Congregation Mikveh Israel, one of the oldest synagogues in North America. Salomon became an active member. The revolution had been fought using extraordinary language about liberty and equality. But there was an obvious question. Did those principles actually include Jews? Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution guaranteed substantial religious freedom, but anyone serving in the state legislature was required to acknowledge the divine inspiration of both the Old and New Testaments. A Jew could live there, a Jew could worship there, a Jew could help finance its revolution. But a Jew who rejected the New Testament could not satisfy the religious test required for political office. In 1783, Salomon joined other prominent Philadelphia Jews in petitioning Pennsylvania's government to change that. Their argument was essentially, if Jews had shared the burdens of creating this republic, they should share its political rights as well. The restriction wasn't immediately resolved, but the argument they were making anticipated one of the defining principles of the American constitutional settlement. When the United States Constitution was written 4 years later, Article 6 explicitly prohibited religious tests for federal office. But Salomon never saw it. On the 6th of January 1785, Haym Salomon died suddenly in Philadelphia. He was only 44 years old. His youngest son was still an infant. And after his death, the history and the mythology surrounding him began to blur. His descendants believed the new United States still owed their father substantial sums of money. For decades, they petitioned Congress seeking repayment. More than 40 years after Salomon died, his son Haym Moses Salomon wrote to an elderly James Madison. He wanted to know what Madison remembered about his father. Madison couldn't verify all the stories that had developed about him, but he did remember Haym Salomon. He remembered borrowing money from him. He remembered his generosity, and he described him as an upright, intelligent, and friendly man. Today, Haym Salomon is buried in the cemetery of Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, but we don't know precisely where. His grave is unmarked. There's something strangely appropriate about that. A man whose name became surrounded by 2 centuries of American Jewish mythology ultimately disappeared into the historical landscape himself. But strip away those legends and an extraordinary person remains. A Jewish immigrant from Poland arrived in revolutionary America. He was imprisoned by the British. He escaped occupied New York. He helped convert foreign credit into money for a revolution struggling to survive. He personally supported men helping create the new republic. And then he challenged that republic when its promises of liberty didn't yet extend fully to Jews. Salomon helped sustain a revolution whose principles he then demanded should apply to him, his community, and eventually everyone else. His life sits right at the beginning of one of the great experiments of modern Jewish history. Could Jews participate fully in a society without first having to stop being Jews? Haym Salomon helped push the American answer towards yes. And that is why Haym Salomon is my latest history maker.